So we're going to start with fingerprint pattern interpretation. And this section is going to deal with the three basic fingerprint patterns: the arch, loop, and whorl. We're also going to talk about classification terminology and nomenclature of each pattern. Now, there may be some technical rules and exceptions concerning pattern interpretation and core placement, we'll talk about core in a moment, that have been intentionally left out of the course. This is an overview, this is introduction. If we really wanted to get into this, we would need much more time. So I'm going to leave some rules and exceptions out of what we're talking about. Also, we should keep in mind that since manual fingerprint classification has been replaced with automated systems, much of this information is historical. So why cover fingerprint classification tonight? Well, the reason is many departments still require their examiners to know it and to have some knowledge of classifications as a requirement for employment. There are even, I post jobs almost every day on my website, and those that have to do with fingerprint analysis, they almost always talk about the Henry classification system, that you have to be knowledgeable in it. So we're going to cover it, even though it may not be used much due to the automated systems. First of all, an understanding of the Henry classification system. Now, there's two classifications we're going to be talking about: the Henry classification system and the NCIC classification system. We're going to start with the Henry first. The understanding of this system is needed when comparing latent prints against known prints. The Henry system is named for Sir Edward Richard Henry, and he came up with this system in 1901. He simplified classification systems developed by others and made his system applicable to law enforcement work. And it has stood the test of time until we started going, full automation. This is what we have been using. Now, in some other countries, they do use other systems, but in the English-speaking countries and countries that were British possessions, like India, they all use the Henry system. Fingerprint classification only applies to 10-print fingerprint cards. The purpose of classifying a 10-print fingerprint card is to file and retrieve the card only using the fingerprints. So you have no name, you have no date of birth, you have no other information, all you have is the fingerprints. This is how you can file and retrieve those cards. And the fingerprints are filed by a formula based on pattern types, the fingers on which they appear, and the technical sizes of the fingerprint pattern. When a subsequent set of fingerprints of the same person, whether the person's rearrested or there's a background check, when a subsequent set is received, an identical or similar formula or classification is placed on the new card. This card is then searched through that particular section of the file, and any prior record is found most of the time. No system is perfect, and that includes the automated systems. While it's true that no two people have the same ridge or arrangement on their fingers, our fingerprints are different, they can and often do have the same fingerprint classification. So if you're searching, classify the 10 print cards that have been classified, you will see that some of them have the same classification, but the fingerprints will be entirely different. That being said, an understanding of the Henry classification system is needed when comparing latent prints against known prints. So let's take a look at more. We'll start with the types of patterns. Fingerprint patterns are grouped into three general types of patterns. You've all heard this before: loops, arches, and whorls. These primary groups are then subdivided into 8 smaller groups. Maybe you haven't heard of the smaller groups. The fingerprint patterns used in classification appear on the bulb portion of the distal end of the fingers and thumbs. Or you could say fingertips and the tip of the thumb. Now, let's talk, before we get into those different types, let's talk about a little terminology here. A couple of things we need to know as we are discussing the types. It'll make it more understandable. There are the 2 main things. The core. The core is the center of the pattern area. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. The other term is delta. The delta is the point on a ridge at or in front of the nearest of the center of where the type lines diverge or separate and surround or tend to surround the pattern area. That's quite a definition. A little bit easier definition, it's the area where it appears the ridges flow in 3 different directions. That's easier to remember and understand. Here we have ridges that are flowing in 3 different directions in one spot. You have them going this way and that way and that way. So that would be a simplified drawing of what a delta may look like. Here is a couple of illustrations, and the C's are cores. All right. Remember, the core is the center of the pattern area. So here's a core. We have the ridges flowing like this, and that's the core. Also on this one, it looks like it's the same one reversed, but they're 2 different fingerprints actually. And this is the core also. Then the delta, again, is where we have, it looks like there are 3 different directions. So here we have a delta here and a delta here. So it's important to know the core and the delta. That's going to help us to determine what the print is when we look for the core and the delta. It'll also help us to identify, especially with loops, the number of ridges between the core and delta. We'll get to that in a moment. All right. So that's the core and the delta. So now let's look at those 3 main pattern types. All right. Loops, arches, and whorls. Those are the general types. These primary groups are then going to be subdivided into 8 smaller groups. We'll get to that. The fingerprint patterns used in classification, again, are on the distal end of our fingers and thumbs. We'll start with loops. Now, approximately 65% of the pattern types found on fingers are loops. So that's the majority. We find more loops than anything else. Now, here's the definition of a loop. The technical definition is that a loop is that type of pattern in which one or more ridges enter upon either side, recurve, touch or pass an imaginary line between the delta and core, and pass out or tend to pass out upon the same side the ridges entered. All right. So in other words, the ridges come in one side of the pattern, as we see here. They run or tend to run to the approximate center of the print. They recurve, in other words, they make a U-turn and run out or tend to run out the same side they began. All right, so here we have it. This is a loop because the ridges flow in and flow out the same direction with a recurve. All right. Now, loops are divided into 2 types, ulnar and radial. However, you must know on which hand the loop appears to determine if it's ulnar or a radial loop. When it's unknown from which hand the loop is from, as is common with evidence prints, then loops are divided into right slope and left slope loops. Okay, once again, the three characteristics of the loop are a sufficient recurve, one delta, and a ridge count across a looping ridge. I didn't say that before, but I'm going to show that to you in just a moment. All right, so here we have an example of a couple of loops. We don't know what hand they came off of, so we are only going to be able to say this is a right slope loop and this is a left slope loop. In the example on the left, the ridges enter from the right. On the right side of the pattern, they run toward the center, they recurve and come back to the right side. This would be described a right slope loop, or it could be said that this loop is flowing to the right. Now, a good way to remember, imagine if you filled the ridges with water, which direction would the water flow out? It would flow out to our right. So this is a right slope loop. This one, obviously, is a left slope loop. All of the ridges are flowing, they come in from the left side, they recurve and come back. If you poured water into those ridges, they would all flow out to the left. This is a left slope loop. For classification purposes only, if the one on the left here, the right slope loop, appeared on any finger in the right hand, it's going to be an ulnar loop. That's because it's flowing towards the ulnar side of the hand. That's the side of the hand that's closest, where the ulnar bone is on your arm. The fingerprint on the left hand, then it's going to be a radial loop. This is the ulnar side of the hand. This is the ulnar bone, and see it goes down towards the pinky, or the small finger, the number 5 finger, or number 10 finger. So this is the ulnar side. So if our loop is flowing that direction, it's going to be an ulnar. So this is the left hand. If that's flowing this direction, it's going to be an ulnar loop. If it's flowing the other direction, it's a radial loop, because that's the radius side, the radial side, the radius bone. Okay. If you have a right slope loop fingerprint pattern on the right hand, it's going to be classified as an ulnar loop. If you have a right slope loop pattern on the left hand, it's going to be classified a radial loop. If you have a left slope loop pattern on the right hand, it's a radial loop. And if you have a left slope loop pattern on the left hand, it will be classified as an ulnar loop. Now, when we're doing classification, we will know which hand it is because it's on a print card. It's on a 10 print card. If you have a 10 print card, it's going to have all the right hand fingers on the top, and then the next on the bottom row, or the second row, it's going to have all the left hand. So you will know if it's on the right or left hand. If, once again, we are dealing with a latent print that we have lifted at a crime scene, we can see it's a loop that we don't know which hand it's on, then we either call it a right slope loop or a left slope loop. On loop patterns, we have to determine the ridge count for classification purposes. The number of ridges between the core and delta is the ridge count. So the ridge count of a loop is determined by placing an imaginary line between the delta and core of the loop and counting the ridges in between. There has to be at least one for it to be a loop. That's where we're getting to that rule. Each ridge that touches that imaginary straight line that leads from the delta to the core is counted. The core and the delta are not counted. Here is a loop. And we can see that this is a right sloping loop. The ridges are coming in from the right and they flow back out. If we put water in there, it would flow out to the right. So that's a right slope loop. Now, as far as the count goes, we have to count the number of ridges between the core and the delta to get our ridge count. The ridge count is done by placing an imaginary line between the delta, so here's the delta, and the core, and counting those ridges on that line. Now, typically when you're doing this, you have a fingerprint examiner's glass, something like this, and the fingerprint examiner's glass actually has in the bottom of it a line, and so you have that line right there in front of you, okay? But in any case, each ridge that touches that imaginary straight line is counted, and the core and the delta are not. So this is a right slope loop, and this actually has, well, let's find out, the ridge count. Now, you do not count the core, so I'm not going to count that, but I will count this one. So that's 1. Now, right here, and I'm sure this is hard for you to see, this ridge here does not actually touch the line. It comes close, but it doesn't touch, so I'm not going to count it. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So not counting the core, I have a count of 12. All right, so there you go. There's a ridge count of 12. This is what helps us to do it. We have a comparison magnifier, usually when we do this, and they are nice because you have this, as you can adjust the height, so you can focus and make the size the way you want it, mostly focus. And then in the base, there is a reticule, and the reticule is just a glass piece that actually can be removed. You can get different styles. This is the typical one. And then you can go ahead and do your counting. Also, a lot of times we use a ridge counter, something to actually count as you are looking through there. So something with a point on the end. Arches are less common. Only about 5% of all fingerprint patterns are arches. In the basic arch pattern, the ridges enter from one side of the finger, rise in the center, and flow out the other side, making an arch pattern. So there are 2 types of arches, and we need to be able to put them in these subgroups for classification. There's the plain arch, and there is the tinted arch. So let's look at the examples. Here is a plain arch. With a plain arch, the ridges enter on one side of the impression, flow or tend to flow out the other side with a rise or a wave in the center. So here we go. We've got the ridges coming in from one side of the finger, flowing with a rise or a wave pattern and flowing out the other side. So that's a plain arch. Then we have the tinted arch. With a tinted arch, most of the ridges enter on one side of the impression and flow or tend to flow out the other side. However, the ridges or ridge, it could be just one, at the center of the arch do not. The ridges at the center may form a definite angle of 90 degrees or less. One or more of the ridges at the center may form an upthrust, or the tinted arch may have a combination of 2 of the 3 basic requirements of a loop, but lack the 3rd. I'll talk about that on the next slide. So as we look at this, could this be a loop? No, it's a tinted arch. We have these ridges flowing out, as we see here. And because we have one or more that just go straight up like this, this is a tinted tinted arch. Now, how do we tell the difference between a tinted arch and a lower count loop? Now, I think I mentioned you could have just one ridge and that is between the delta and core on an arch, and that would make it an arch. But how do we know that the difference between a tinted arch with a low count loop, a low count that could be a loop? All right. Well, you have to have three things for a loop. All right. So I'm kind of going back to loops again. One thing you have to have is a sufficient recurve. In other words, there has to be at least one ridge that comes back on itself like this. If it only comes up and stops like that, that's not a sufficient recurve. And a tinted arch often will have something like that. Okay. The second thing you have to have for a loop is a delta. And we remember what a delta is. A delta is where it appears the ridges flow in three directions. And the third thing you need for that loop is a ridge count between the delta and the core. When you do that, if you get at least one ridge, usually there's more, but when you get one ridge or more, it's a loop. If there are none between the core and the delta, then it's not a loop. All right. So that's how you can tell the difference. Going back to the tinted arch, we see that most of the ridges entered on one side of the impression, and they flow or tend to flow out the other side. Most of them. All right. But we have a ridge or some ridges at the center that do not. They can form a definite angle of 90 degrees or less. One or more of the ridges at the center may form an upthrust, or the tinted arch may have any combination of the three basic requirements of the loop that lack the third. So if you don't have all three, then it's going to be a tinted arch. All right. So loops must have a sufficient recurve, a delta, and a ridge count across the looping ridge or across the looping ridge. If you don't have one of those things, it's now a tinted arch. So we talked about loops. We talked about arches. Now let's talk about whorls. 30 to 35% of fingerprint patterns are whorls. And there are four subdivisions of whorls. There is the plain whorl, the central pocket loop whorl, the double loop whorl, and the accidental whorl. Okay, so let's see what those are, how to identify them. All right, so a plain whorl. It's so obvious. You look at it and it looks like a whirlpool right in the middle here. It's a whorl, okay? Now, a whorl, a plain whorl, contains two deltas and one or more ridges that make or tend to make a complete circuit when an imaginary line is drawn between the two deltas. At least one of these recurving ridges within the inner pattern area is cut or touched. So if I draw an imaginary line between these two deltas, okay, remember a plain whorl has two deltas. If I draw a line there, one or more of these ridges that form this complete circuit kind of pattern touches or breaks that line. Then what we have is a plain whorl. Now let's talk about the central pocket whorl. All right. On a central pocket whorl, what that is a whorl having two deltas with a recurving ridge in front of each And when an imaginary line is drawn between the two deltas, no recurving line is cut or touched. All right, so let's look at that. Now, this is a plane whorl. We already saw that one. On a central pocket whorl, if we draw a line between the two deltas, if there's no recurving ridge touching the line, then it's a central pocket whorl. Now, one way you can really find this is on the central pocket whorl, that delta is usually closer to the core. Almost always it's going to be closer to the core. When you have the plane whorls, they're a little bit more spaced out. Then we have the double loop whorl. That consists of two separate loop formations with two separate and distinct sets of shoulders or sufficient recurves, and it also has the two deltas. The two loops in the pattern area must be formed by separate ridges. All right, so here, based on that definition, we have two separate loop formations. So here's one here and here's one here. We have the two deltas, and this formation is its own ridges, and this formation is from its own ridges. So that would be a double loop whorl. And then the next one is the accidental whorl. Now, this is the rarest of all the types of whorls, the 4 types of whorls. It consists of a combination of 2 different types of patterns, with the exception of the plane arch, with 2 or more deltas, or a pattern which possesses some of the requirements for 2 or more different types, or a pattern which conforms to none of the definitions. Now, I know that's a mouthful, so just remember that the accidental whorl doesn't look like anything else, and it doesn't follow any other rules. So just know that there is such a thing as an accidental whorl, okay? So this one, if you start looking at it, it doesn't meet those other requirements. Now, when it comes to whorls, there is one more thing we have to do, we have to know, and that's tracing. For classification purposes, we're going to have to trace our whorls. With the loop pattern, going back to that, remember it's classified by its type, ulnar or radial, and the ridge count. We're going to see that when we come to the classification. A whorl is classified by its type and its tracing. So its type is going to be plane or double loop, and then the tracing, which we're going to see now. All right, to trace a whorl, what we do is we go to the farthest left delta and trace, that is, follow the ridges to a point directly opposite the farthest right delta. If the ridge ends, as we're doing the tracing, we drop down to the next ridge and continue. If the ridge bifurcates or divides, makes like a fork, if the ridge bifurcates that we're tracing, we follow the lower fork and continue. So let's look at that now. All right, so here we have a tracing. So we go ahead and we find the left delta. Here's the right delta. Okay, left delta, right delta. So we start tracing the ridge between this delta and the other. So we find the lower one of the ridges and we follow it along. Now, if the ridge stops, we're going to drop down to the next ridge and keep going. If it bifurcates, we take the lower part of the fork and keep going. This one's just looks like it's just one ridge. So when we trace it along, we see that it falls in between the delta and the core. Now, the point is, it has to be 3 or more ridges inside the core. All right, so this is definitely 3 or more. We've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ridges there. So definitely that's an inner tracing. It starts at the core on the left, traces along, and falls on the inside of this delta. So that's an inner tracing, 3 or more ridges on the inside. All right, so that's a inner tracing, or we use an I to designate it as inner. Now, if you are tracing and you go along and it falls on the outside of the other core, then it's an outer tracing. And once again, it's got to be 3 or more ridges outside the other core. So here's the other core here. I was pointing the wrong place. Here's the other core here. And obviously, we are many more ridges than 3 or than 2. And so this is an outer tracing as we follow those ridges from this core out to the right. So this is an outer tracing, or we'd use an O for outer. All right, one more, and that's the meeting tracing. Now, if you trace and it hits the other delta, or it's less than 3 ridges inside or outside the delta, then it's a meeting trace, or an M. So here we are at this delta, the delta on the left. We trace that ridge and it comes right to the other delta. And so that would be a meeting tracing, or an M. If it was 1 ridge or 2 ridges inside, or 1 ridge or 2 ridges outside that delta, it would still be a meeting trace. All right. So that's what we do with whorls. We have to do a tracing. So the way these are classified, a plain whorl with an inner tracing would be a PI. If it's a central pocket loop whorl with an outer tracing, it'd be CO. If it was an inner tracing with a central pocket, it'd be CI. If it was a meeting, it would be a CM.